Have you ever witnessed a situation where someone was treated unfairly because of their appearance? On this flight, everything seemed peaceful until a flight attendant, full of self-confidence and arrogance, decided to humiliate an elderly woman. The reason? The color of your skin. The one who should be responsible for offering comfort and safety to passengers became, at that moment, the source of contempt and embarrassment. Little did the flight attendant know that in a matter of minutes, her cruel and prejudiced attitude would bring an unexpected and painful consequence. While the passengers watched, astonished and not knowing how to react, the elderly woman remained calm, without imagining the impact that her true identity would have on everyone. This was not just an ordinary lady, and what was about to be revealed would change the course of this story in ways no one could have predicted. Stay until the end, because this twist will transform the way you see the people around you. Prejudice is dangerous, and in this story, we'll see how it can come back to teach us life's hardest lessons. It all started when the elderly woman got on the plane. Her steps were slow, marked by the weight of age, but there was something about her that caught your attention. A silent dignity. He dressed simply, his clean and discreet clothes contrasting with the artificial elegance of the crew. The wrinkles on his face told stories, and his calm and attentive look demonstrated the wisdom acquired over the years. The flight attendant, on the other hand, was young, full of attitude and confidence. His actions demonstrated an almost mechanical demeanor, as if each gesture was calculated to appear professional, but there was a coldness in his gaze. She seemed impatient, especially with the passengers who, in her eyes, did not deserve her attention. When the elderly woman approached to ask for help, she was ignored with an indifferent look. The lack of cordiality was already visible, but the worst was yet to come. The elderly woman, trying to get comfortable in her seat, asked the flight attendant to help her with her luggage. The answer was dry, almost harsh. "Can't you put it on yourself?" The lady, with difficulty, tried to explain that she was unable to lift the suitcase because of her age. Instead of receiving compassion, the flight attendant's response was filled with sarcasm. "Maybe you should think about that before traveling alone." The tension in the air began to grow. Other passengers watched, some clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but no one intervened. The elderly woman tried to remain calm, but the public humiliation was evident. The prejudice emanating from the flight attendant was more than just professional arrogance. It was a clear manifestation of discrimination. The elderly woman, without saying another word, simply lowered her gaze. His expression showed no anger, just resigned acceptance. However, there was something deeper going on there. The passengers who watched everything felt a mixture of outrage and helplessness, but what they didn't know was that this humble lady had a secret that would change everything. And soon, the flight attendant would discover in the most bitter way the fatal mistake she had made. The tension on board began to spread like a silent murmur. With each step, the flight attendant took along the corridor. Her haughty posture and disdainful gaze made it clear that she considered herself superior to the elderly woman. Now, after the first exchange of harsh words, she seemed almost determined to show that she had control. When it was time for in-flight service, the situation got worse. The flight attendant delivered the meals with a professional smile to all the other passengers, but when she reached the elderly woman, the smile disappeared. Without even a glance, he roughly placed the tray of food in front of the lady, spilling part of the contents on the table. The elderly woman, remaining calm, thanked her with a nod, even after the clear lack of respect. That wasn't enough for the flight attendant. Feeling perhaps provoked by the lady's silent dignity, she leaned over and murmured in a low tone, but audible enough for nearby passengers to hear, "Perhaps people like you should learn to fly planes more suited to your level." A cold smile appeared on her face, as if she was satisfied with the humiliation imposed. The atmosphere became heavy. Nearby passengers began to exchange uneasy glances, shocked by what they had just heard. Some murmured among themselves, indignant at the flight attendant's behavior, but again, no one had the courage to intervene directly. The elderly woman, in turn, remained calm. Her silence now seemed stronger than any words, as if she knew the time for her answer would come, and it wouldn't be long before that. With each passing second, the atmosphere inside the plane became more tense. The passengers who had witnessed the scene looked at each other, some in absolute silence, others murmuring in low voices, visibly uncomfortable. A man in the front row frowned and looked like he was about to say something but hesitated. Beside him, a woman shook her head disapprovingly, muttering something about lack of respect. An awkward silence took over the aircraft corridor. The elderly woman, who had remained calm until then, just sighed and carefully adjusted her tray, as if trying in some way to minimize the embarrassing situation. There were no complaints on his part, no attempt to respond to the humiliation he had just suffered. However, his face carried a deep wisdom, something that the other passengers began to notice. Behind the elderly woman, a young woman tried to record the incident with her cell phone, but surreptitiously, fearing that the flight attendant would notice. Others around him whispered words of indignation, not understanding how someone in a position of service could be so cruel. "How can she act like this?" whispered an indignant voice. "She doesn't know who she's dealing with," said another, without even imagining how true that statement was. The flight attendant, realizing that she was the center of attention, continued to walk down the corridor, now showing an expression of satisfaction. He seemed to enjoy the discomfort generated around him, as if he was sure he was immune to any kind of repercussions. After all, for her, the elderly woman was just another insignificant passenger. But what the flight attendant didn't know, and what everyone would soon discover, is that that lady had the biggest surprise of all in store. That calm look and trembling hands carried a secret that would completely transform the environment, and soon no one would be silent anymore. Then came the moment that no one could have predicted. When the plane was preparing to begin the landing procedure, a murmur began to circulate among the cabin crew. The commotion appeared to originate in the hallway, near business class, and soon spread. Passengers around began to notice that something was happening. The flight attendant, still oblivious to the seriousness of the situation, continued to perform her duties with the same disdain and arrogance. Suddenly, one of the flight attendants approached the flight attendant with a look that mixed urgency and embarrassment. He whispered something in her ear, and what followed was a radical change in his expression. From confident and haughty, the flight attendant turned pale. His eyes widened, and his posture collapsed in an instant. The message conveyed by his colleague seemed to have broken down all his defenses. In a quick gesture, the flight attendant turned to the elderly woman. His steps, once firm and determined, were now faltering. She approached the lady with a nervous smile, clearly trying to undo what she had done. His voice, which had previously been cold and laced with sarcasm, now trembled as he stammered, I'm sorry. I didn't know." The closest passengers looked on curiously, trying to understand what had happened to cause such a drastic change. It was then that the revelation happened. In a calm and serene voice, the elderly woman looked at the flight attendant and said, "Maybe it's too late for apologies, dear. I am the founder and owner of this airline." The silence on the plane was absolute. The information seemed to have been a fatal blow to the flight attendant, who staggered back in complete disbelief. The shocked passengers began to murmur among themselves. The simple and humble woman who had been humiliated throughout the flight was not just another passenger. She was the force behind the entire airline operation. Every insult, every gesture of contempt now came back full force against the flight attendant. The elderly woman, still maintaining a serene posture, added, "You thought you could judge me by my appearance, but what you didn't know is that respect and dignity go far beyond what we can see. And that, young lady, you're going to learn the hard way." His voice didn't carry hatred, but rather a deep wisdom and compassion, as if he wanted to teach the flight attendant a lesson she would never forget. The flight attendant, now visibly shaking, tried to justify herself, but the words seemed to escape her mouth. He knew he had made an irreparable mistake, and shame was written all over his face. There was no turning back. The justice she never imagined facing was there, personified in the figure of that elderly woman who, until then, she had treated as inferior. The impact of that revelation was felt by everyone on the plane. The silence that took over the environment was not only the result of surprise, but also of the reflection that inevitably arose among the passengers. Each one, from their place, began to mentally revisit what had just happened. Many had already been outraged by the flight attendant's attitude, but now the feeling was deeper. It was a call to reflect on how appearances often deceive us and lead us to commit injustices. Prejudice, which manifested itself so cruelly on that flight, is something that many prefer to believe is not part of their lives. But there, upon witnessing what the flight attendant had done, the passengers were confronted with an uncomfortable truth. We judge others based on the superficial, the color of their skin, their age, their appearance, and we forget that, behind each face, there is a history, a dignity, that cannot be measured by labels. The elderly woman, still sitting in her seat, seemed calm. She didn't need to say anything anymore. His presence, his revelation, and the silent lesson he conveyed were more powerful than any long speech could be. For most passengers, it was clear that what had happened there was not just an isolated mistake, but a reflection of something much larger. The lack of empathy and hasty judgment that permeates our society. The flight attendant, now embarrassed, tried to redeem herself, but the weight of her actions was evident. His once arrogant posture had transformed into a mix of regret and shame. There was no longer superiority in her gaze, just the painful realization that her choices, fueled by unconscious prejudices, had led her to a devastating mistake. This moment of reflection on the plane was a lesson not only for the flight attendant, but for everyone present. And for anyone watching this story, the lesson is clear. Never judge someone by their appearance, color, or age. A person's true value is far beyond what the eyes can see. And life, as the elderly woman on that flight showed, always finds a way to teach us this in unexpected and sometimes painful ways. After the devastating revelation, the flight attendant's transformation was inevitable. She, who until then had displayed a posture of superiority, was now completely disconcerted. The weight of what he had done finally fell on his shoulders. With teary eyes and a trembling voice, she approached the elderly woman again, this time with a completely different attitude. There were no longer any traces of arrogance. What remained was sincere and deep regret. "Please forgive me," she whispered, barely able to look the lady in the eye. Shame seemed to consume her, and regret was evident. Her body, once erect and confident, was now curved, almost begging for a second chance, for a forgiveness she didn't know if she deserved. The elderly woman, with the serenity that was characteristic of her, looked at the young flight attendant. His eyes, filled with understanding, carried no resentment. She knew the lesson had been learned, and although it had been a painful journey for the flight attendant, this moment of transformation was the most important. "We all make mistakes," the lady said softly. "The important thing is to learn from them and never repeat them." The flight attendant nodded, visibly moved. She knew her actions couldn't be erased, but what mattered now was what she would do from that moment on. The lesson she learned on that flight would stay with her for the rest of her life. More than a correction of behavior, that experience had caused a real transformation in the way he saw the people around him. The flight was coming to an end, but the change in the flight attendant was evident. Instead of hiding, she decided to face her mistakes head-on. The look of contempt he had once given his passengers was replaced by sincere humility. She knew she had a lot to reflect on, and that from now on, every person she met would be treated with respect, regardless of their appearance. The transformation was complete, and the lesson was recorded forever. As the plane prepared to land, the mood on board had changed radically. The passengers, who had initially been indignant and perplexed, now exchanged knowing glances. What began as a story of prejudice and humiliation turned into a powerful testimony of learning and personal growth. The elderly woman, in her silent dignity, had become the hero of that journey, not only to herself, but to everyone present. When the plane finally touched down, applause echoed in the cabin, not only for the successful landing, but also in recognition of the elderly woman's courage and the flight attendant's transformation. The moment was not just about a flight, but about a collective call for change. As the doors opened and passengers began to stand up, there was an atmosphere of reflection in the air. Those who were there were about to leave, not just as individuals, but as part of a community that had shared a meaningful experience. The elderly woman's words echoed in the minds of many. Respect and dignity go far beyond what we can see. This message resonated, creating a space for people to reconsider how they treat others in their daily lives. Prejudice, which often infiltrates everyday interactions, wasn't just that flight attendant's problem. It was a challenge that everyone faces, to varying degrees, in various spheres of their lives. The flight attendant, now aware of the impact of her actions, decided it was time to redeem herself. Upon leaving the plane, she looked for the elderly woman to express her gratitude. "Thank you for teaching me such an important lesson. I promise I will be better," she said, with sincerity in her eyes. The elderly woman, with a welcoming smile, replied, "And remember, we are all capable of changing. The important thing is that you are willing to learn." This story doesn't end here. The lessons each of the passengers learned that day are not limited to a single event. They are a continual reminder that prejudice and disdain have no place in a society that strives for empathy and understanding. Each of us has the power to impact someone's life, whether positively or negatively. And sometimes a single interaction can change the course of a life. By sharing this story, we hope that everyone who hears it reflects on their own attitudes and behaviors. May this story inspire change, and may everyone strive to see beyond appearances, treating each person with the respect and dignity they deserve. Because at the end of the day, we are all human beings, and our stories are interconnected in ways we often cannot understand.